There are certain words in basketball that could follow a player forever, right? Choker is probably the worst one, but if you play badly in the wrong game 7, blow the wrong series lead, or disappear in the wrong fourth quarter, people might bring it up for the next 20, 30 years. But here's what I've always found interesting: the label isn't applied equally. Some players have one terrible playoff moment and spend the rest of their careers trying to escape it. Meanwhile, other legends have multiple playoff collapses sitting right there on their resume, and nobody talks about them. And so today, we're going to talk about them. But we're going to do something a little different because we're not just looking for players who lost playoff series, because everybody loses. Michael Jordan lost, LeBron lost, Kobe, Stephen Curry, everybody lost. What I'm looking for are situations where a superstar had a legitimate opportunity to win, his team was competitive enough to win, and his individual performance played a significant role in why they didn't. And some of the names we're about to talk about might surprise you. And so, with that being said, cue the intro. And so, before we start naming players, we need to name some rules because basketball discourse has destroyed the meaning of the word choke. Losing to a better team is not automatically choking. Losing when your second best player is injured isn't automatically choking. Putting up 35 points and losing because your defense gives up 130 is not choking. For this video, I'm looking at 4 things. Number 1, expectations. Was your team actually supposed to compete in this series? Number 2, opportunity. Did you have a series lead, home court advantage, an elimination game at home, or some other realistic path to winning? Number 3, individual performance. Did the superstar maintain his normal level of production when the pressure increased? And finally, number 4, context. Because shooting 6 for 20 doesn't automatically mean somebody choked, right? Who was guarding him? What was the spacing like? Was he injured? What did his teammates do? With that established, let's get controversial. Starting off with one, Chris Paul. Chris Paul is probably the strangest player to include on this list because technically, people do criticize his playoff resume. But I still don't think the average NBA fan realizes how many opportunities disappeared during his career. And that's because CP3's reputation as one of the smartest and most efficient point guards ever is completely justified. That's what makes his postseason history so much more fascinating. And so let's start in 2008. Paul's Hornets took a 3-2 series lead over the San Antonio Spurs in the Western Conference semifinals. New Orleans had Game 7 at home. Paul actually played pretty well in Game 7, but at the end of the day, San Antonio won. So I wouldn't call that a Chris Paul choke. But it becomes important when you realize how often this situation repeats throughout his career. Bring it on down to 2015. This is the series that has to be discussed. The Clippers are playing Houston. Los Angeles goes up 3-1. 3-1. They have an opportunity to close Houston out, but they don't. Then comes Game 6. The Clippers are leading by 19 points late into the third quarter. James Harden, the Houston Rockets' best player, spends much of Houston's comeback on the bench. And Houston somehow wins. And then Houston wins Game 7 as well. This is one of the worst blown opportunities of the modern NBA. And although Chris Paul wasn't individually terrible throughout the series, when you are the leader and you are the point guard of a team that blows a 3-1 lead, it's going on the resume. But CP3's most painful chapter might actually be 2018. Houston goes up 3-2 against Golden State. For the first time, it genuinely looks like someone has solved the Kevin Durant Warriors. And then Chris Paul hurts his hamstring. Houston loses Game 6 and 7. That is not choking, that is horrible luck. And this distinction matters because Chris Paul's playoff history is a combination of both. There are legitimate disappointments and there are situations where his body failed him at the worst possible time. But then we have Phoenix. In 2021, the Suns reached the NBA Finals. They go up 2-0 against Milwaukee and then lose 4 consecutive games. Paul was not terrible. In fact, he was productive offensively. But Phoenix had his opportunity, and 1 year later, things get even worse. Because the Suns win 64 games, the best record in basketball. They play Dallas in the second round. Phoenix goes up 2-0, and then Game 7 happens. At home, Chris Paul scores 10 points. Phoenix trails by 30 by halftime. Dallas absolutely humiliates them. And so Chris Paul's playoff reputation is complicated. Some failures are unfairly blamed on him, but there are enough blown opportunities that we can't pretend the pattern does not exist. And then, I might get canceled for this one. But Kevin Durant. This is where people might start getting uncomfortable because Kevin Durant is genuinely considered an elite playoff performer. And statistically, he is. This is one of the greatest scorers postseason basketball has ever seen. But Durant has one enormous playoff collapse that would define almost anybody else's career much more severely. 2016, Oklahoma City versus the Golden State Warriors. The Warriors just won 73 games, OKC is not favored, and the Thunder go up 3-1. That is 3 games to 1. At that point, all expectations change. I don't care if you are the 10-win Bobcats versus the 73-win Warriors. You go up 3-1 on a team, you are expected to close that out. But now you don't have to be favored before a series for a loss to become a collapse. If you're up 3-1, you've put yourself in a position to win. Now look at Durant shooting in the final 3 games. We look at Game 5, we see 12 for 31. Game 6, we see 10 for 31. Game 7, we see 10 for 19. Game 6 is the one that stands out. OKC is at home. They can eliminate Golden State. Durant takes 31 shots, makes 10. Russell Westbrook also struggles. Klay Thompson catches absolute fire. Golden State survives, and the rest is history. The Warriors complete the 3-1 comeback. Durant joins Golden State that same summer. And ironically, that decision might be one reason we don't discuss the collapse as much. Because Durant immediately becomes nearly unbeatable. He wins 2 championships, 2 finals MVPs. He has a monster performance on basketball's biggest stage. The championship success changed the conversation. But imagine if Durant never joined Golden State. Imagine he finishes his career without a championship. What would we say about 2016? It would probably be one of the first things mentioned when discussing his career. That's how much championships can rewrite your history. And now, Kawhi Leonard. I'm sorry, that was horrible. This one gets forgotten. When people discuss Kawhi Leonard in the playoffs, they usually remember 2 things. 2014 Finals MVP and the incredible 2019 run with Toronto. That 2019 run created an almost mythological playoff reputation around Kawhi. The game winner against Philly, beating Milwaukee, beating Golden State, but 1 year later, something happened that doesn't get nearly enough attention. And that would be the 2020 Clippers. This team entered the season as one of the championship favorites. We all remember the hype when Kawhi joined the Clippers instead of going to LA with LeBron. The Clippers the Clippers and Lakers rivalry was something crazy that year. There was the commercials, there was everything. And so you have Kawhi Leonard, you have Paul George, Lou Williams, Montrezl Harrell, Marcus Morris, Patrick Beverley. They were deep, they were talented. And against the Denver Nuggets, the Clippers went up 3-1. What did I say? You go up 3-1, all excuses go out the door. They blew a 16-point lead in Game 5. They blew another major league in Game 6, and then comes Game 7. This is where Kawhi's performance becomes impossible to ignore. 14 points. That's 1-4, people. 14 points, 6 for 22 shooting, 0 points in the fourth quarter. 0 points in the fourth quarter. Paul George gets destroyed for his performance, and deservedly so. But Kawhi was the best player. He was the reigning Finals MVP. He was supposed to be the guy who gave the Clippers championship credibility. And in the biggest game of their season, he disappeared offensively. Yet compare the way people talk about Kawhi's 2020 collapse with the way they talk about James Harden failures or Chris Paul's failures. It's nowhere close. Kawhi's 2019 championship essentially gave him full immunity. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes one championship changes how every other failure gets remembered. And now let's push it back a little bit, right? Because now we have Steve Nash. This is an older example. But Steve Nash's playoff career is remembered for the most part positively. 2-time MVP, leader of the 7 seconds or less Suns, one of the greatest offensive point guards ever. And Phoenix absolutely had terrible luck, to be fair. The Robert Horry hip check situation, Amari Stoudemire's suspension, Joe Johnson's injury, those things matter. They do matter. But there's another side to the story. Nash never reached the NBA Finals. Not once. And we're talking about a player who won consecutive MVPs while leading some of the best offenses in basketball. Not to mention 2 consecutive MVPs in the era of Kobe Bryant, Shaquille O'Neal, Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett. I mean, everyone was, all the legends we talk about today, for the most part, was playing during this time, the Kevin Garnetts. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, in 2006, Phoenix reaches the Western Conference Finals against Dallas. They win Game 1. Eventually, Dallas wins the series in 6. In 2010, Phoenix reaches another Western Conference Finals. They push the Lakers to 6 games. Again, Nash plays well. That's why I wouldn't call Nash a traditional choker. He's here for a different reason. His resume demonstrates how differently we treat playoff failure depending on expectations and personality. Nash generally performed well. His teams just couldn't finish the job. But imagine another 2-time MVP playing his entire prime without making the NBA Finals. Would fans today be this forgiving? Probably not. And so Nash isn't necessarily guilty of choking. He's an example of how selective the label can be. And now we get to somebody whose postseason resume deserves much more scrutiny. Karl Malone is one of the greatest regular season players ever. 2nd all-time MVP voting finishes, 2 MVP awards, more than 36,000 career points. But the playoffs, that's where things become complicated. The Utah Jazz were contenders for years before finally reaching consecutive NBA Finals. And Malone had some painful moments. The most painful comes in 1997 NBA Finals. Game 1, tie game. Malone goes to the free throw line late. Scottie Pippen famously tells him the mailman does not deliver on Sundays. Malone misses both free throws. Jordan hits the game winner, Chicago wins. Now obviously, one pair of missed free throws didn't decide the entire series, but it's symbolic of the larger issue. Malone's regular season scoring efficiency generally declined in the playoffs, and Utah had several disappointing postseason exits during years when Malone and John Stockton were elite. Then comes 1998. Utah gets another chance. They have home court advantage over Chicago because the Jazz won 62 games. The Bulls also won 62, but Utah held the tiebreaker. Game 6, Utah is trying to force a Game 7. Late in the game, Malone has the ball in the post. Jordan strips him, Chicago comes down, Jordan hits the shot over Byron Russell, series over, game over. Again, one play does not erase Malone's greatness. But when we're discussing playoff legacies, it's remarkable how much Stockton and Malone are romanticized as this legendary duo without the same level of criticism modern superstars receive for failing to win. And since we're already in Utah, let's talk about John Stockton, because he's universally remembered as the ultimate pure point guard, all-time assist leader, all-time steals leader, incredible longevity, elite decision making. But here's my question. Why doesn't Stockton receive more criticism for Utah's postseason shortcomings? Part of it is because he wasn't considered the primary scorer. Malone carried more of the superstar expectations, but Stockton was still an all-NBA level player. And there were postseason series where Utah desperately needed more offensive aggression from him. This is where evaluating point guards get complicated. Stockton's job wasn't necessarily to score 30. But when playoff defenses become more sophisticated and your offense starts struggling, sometimes your superstar point guard has to become more aggressive. Stockton's efficiency remained impressive, but his relatively low scoring volume meant Utah was heavily dependent on Malone's creation. That isn't necessarily choking, but it does make me question why certain modern point guards get destroyed for not taking over games, while Stockton's lack of scoring aggression is often treated as simply part of his playing style. And again, different eras, different expectations, but also different narratives. And now David Robinson. This is probably my favorite example, because Robinson's reputation today is almost entirely positive, and he deserves a lot of that respect. MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, scoring champion, rebounding champion, 2-time champion, one of the most complete centers ever. But before Tim Duncan arrived, David Robinson had some serious playoff disappointments. The biggest is obviously 1995. Robinson wins MVP. San Antonio wins 62 games. They reached the Western Conference Finals against Houston, and waiting for David Robinson is one Hakeem Olajuwon. What happens next becomes one of the most famous superstar destructions ever. Hakeem averages roughly 35 points per game in the series. Robinson is held to 24. Houston wins in 6. And because Hakeem was upset Robinson won MVP, the series becomes framed as Olajuwon personally proving who the better center was. But what's actually interesting, Robinson eventually wins championships. Except by then, Tim Duncan is there. In 1999, Duncan leads San Antonio in playoff scoring and rebounding. Robinson is still extremely valuable, especially defensively, but he's no longer carrying the same offensive responsibility. So when people list Robinson's 2 championships, that is completely legitimate. But those championships also soften the way history remembers his earlier postseason failures. If Duncan never arrives in San Antonio, David Robinson's legacy might look a little bit different. And now let's talk about a modern example. Joel Embiid. We have to talk about Joel Embiid. Now, Embiid does receive playoff criticism, but considering his regular season accomplishments, I think his postseason resume deserves even more examination. We're talking about an MVP, multiple scoring titles, one of the most dominant regular season players of his generation. And yet his teams repeatedly failed to get beyond the second round during his early prime. 2019 against Toronto, Philly was extremely close. Game 7 comes down to Kawhi's famous bounce. It is difficult to call that a choke. But 2021, that's a different story. Philly is the number 1 seed. They're playing Atlanta. The Sixers go up 2-1. They eventually lose in 7. Ben Simmons receives almost all the blame. And he does deserve criticism. But Embiid had his own mistakes. Philly blew huge leads. Embiid had 8 turnovers in Game 7. Then you go to 2023. Philly goes up 3-2 against Boston. Game 6 is in Philly. Closeout opportunity. Embiid scores 26, but struggles down the stretch. Boston survives. Game 7, Embiid scores 15 points on 5 for 18 shooting. Boston destroys Philly. And this happens right after Embiid wins MVP, which he pretty much begged the league for. I remember that year, and it pissed me off so bad because he literally begged for MVP all year. I've never seen something like that. Imagine some other players winning the MVP and scoring 15 in a Game 7 elimination loss. Imagine Kobe, Kevin Durant, Jokic, Melo. Imagine anyone doing that. Embiid's playoff reputation has taken a hit, but his regular season dominance remains so overwhelming that we still tend to discuss him as one of the very best players in basketball. But at some point, postseason performance has to become part of how we evaluate the player. But now we all know LeBron joined, so they'll probably make it past the second round this year if everything goes healthy. But the ultimate question I'm trying to make is, why do some players escape the label? After looking at all these careers, I think there are a few reasons, right? The biggest one is simple. Championships erase all your sins. Kevin Durant blows a 3-1 lead. 2 championships later, the conversation changes. Kawhi blows a 3-1 lead and scores 14 in Game 7. He already has 2 championships and 2 finals MVPs. David Robinson gets destroyed by Hakeem. Eventually, he retires with 2 wings. Winning doesn't literally erase what happened, but it changes how we interpret it. The second reason is personality. Players who generate controversy tend to have their failures amplified. James Harden's playoff disasters became part of his identity. Russell Westbrook's mistakes become memes. LeBron's 2011 finals has followed him for his whole career. But quieter players sometimes avoid the same level of scrutiny. The third factor is expectations, because roles matter. Nobody expected John Stockton to score like a Michael Jordan, so his failures don't look as dramatic. And finally, we remember moments more than patterns. One horrible Game 7 can become more famous than 5 years of consistently declining postseason efficiency. That's why playoff narratives can become misleading. And so, who deserves the most criticism? If we're talking about repeated lost opportunities, Chris Paul has the strongest case. If we're talking about one catastrophic collapse that gets surprisingly little attention today, Kevin Durant in 2016 and Kawhi Leonard in 2020 are near the top. If we're talking about historical legends whose playoff resumes have become more flattering with time, Karl Malone and David Robinson deserve another look. And if we're talking about a modern superstar whose playoff resume hasn't matched his regular season dominance, Joel Embiid has the most to prove. But that's really the point of this video. Calling someone a playoff choker shouldn't mean that they aren't great. Almost every superstar eventually fails. The question is whether we're judging everyone by the same standard. Because basketball history has a funny way of remembering failure. For some players, one bad series becomes their identity. For others, we barely remembered it happened. So now I want you to think, who's the biggest playoff choker that NBA fans don't talk about enough? And don't just give me James Harden. That is too easy. Give me the player whose reputation, doesn't match what actually happened. And if you enjoyed this kind of breakdown, subscribe, like the video, because we just hit 100 subscribers and we on the road to 150. Let's go, baby.